Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks a lot for coming along and joining me for the next 60 minutes or so, where we're going to be giving you some insight to overcoming the boardroom show and tell. And I'll give a little bit more insight as to what that actually means in just a moment. But who am I in terms of being able to offer this level of insight? So my name's Steve Gaskell. I'm a high performance coach down here in the Southwest. Work with a wide variety of boards and businesses, and really seek to get the very, very best out of those around the boardroom, those around the table, those that are invested or looking to be invested within the business. So this afternoon, I want to use my experience from both being a high performance coach and my coaching practice over the last 8 years. And also my experience from a 28-year military career prior to that, where, believe it or not, there's a lot of discussion around the table. And some of what I'll share this afternoon has been born through that experience, and also what I've also seen and utilized over the past 8 years in building this practice out. Now, the interesting point before I get started on this one is there is a difference between, I guess, that level of integration, that level of engagement on the table from businesses that are both smart and actually what I focus on is how we create healthy organizations. Today being smart isn't enough. It's merely a part of the bigger picture. And at the end of this session today, I'm going to share you the 4 disciplines of a smart organization, a healthy organization. And I've got no doubt that most around the table, most on this session today will be, clearly in organizations that are, very smart, that what they focus on and how they deliver what they do on a day-to-day basis. But I want to be able to offer you a little bit more insight into what makes an organization healthy. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today are the dysfunctions that we often see and find actually around the table, and what that actually means to increasing that ability for the function of the boardroom to have a real focus on the organizational health and making an organization, I guess, as profitable, as efficient as absolutely possible. And more on that towards the end. Just a few points on today. We've got Sam in the background who's going to be moderating our session today. So she is going to be looking out for any of those questions that you might be wanting to ask and offer, and also to be able to engage in terms of the conversation that we can have this afternoon. So I always encourage everybody to really engage on the chat. So as we go through, if you've got any questions, fire them in. Sam will pick up the questions and she'll be able to obviously let me know. And any that I can't directly answer today, I will absolutely get to you in an email to follow up that. That's my commitment to you for sure. But it's also really useful for me just before we get going, just drop in the chat, whereabouts are you? What's the nature of interest into this afternoon? So I've got a bit of an idea. It's always nice to know where we're reaching and who we're talking to. And what's the main thing that you're looking for out of today's session? So whilst you're doing that, let me just really share with you, first of all, what's going to get in the way of actually embracing much of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon in terms of the organizational health. What are the areas that are going to stop us? And they're essentially 3 biases. The first one is sophisticated bias, and this is where organizations often find themselves in a place where they just sense that it's got to be complex. There's got to be a level of complexity that will, actually, in terms of creating organizational health, it can't be simple. It's got to be complex. There's got to be more to this than meets the eye. And the reality on this is that it's not the case. when we start to focus on organizational health, and as you start to see what I talk about with regards to this initial piece around the boardroom table, and then when we look at the 4 disciplines, it isn't difficult. It's not complex. In fact, the approach is in many respects, simplistic, and it's designed that way. The second is where we have this adrenaline bias. And this is where we sense, an organization, even smart organizations, will think to themselves, well, you know what, being healthy, it's going to take time, and we want it now. We're often find ourselves that we're hooked on that daily rush. And here's the thing, give us a show of hands if that resonates with you. Actually, it's the daily rush, it's the firefighting, it's the overwhelm. It's often a case that there is a fear to slow down and deal with issues that are critical, because actually they're not urgent enough to get into our diary. And this adrenaline bias is it stops us from taking a moment to reflect, to see where we are, what it is that we need to do, and how we can go about doing it better. So we've got that sophistication bias. It can't be simple. It's got to be more to it. We've got the adrenaline bias, which is, there's got to be a quick fix. It's, we haven't got time to slow down to do this. We're too busy. And then the last one is this quantification bias. And it's, it must be measurable. If we're going to do this, we've got to be able to measure the outcome. We've got to have a look at how is this going to financially impact on our business. What is the actual tangible bits that I'm going to be able to see on this one? And one of the realities on this is when we start to focus on creating healthy organizations, it takes time. It takes a little bit of time. It might take a couple of months, maybe 2 or 3 months. And actually some of it is quantified over time. And it's not just necessarily a case of, we hit straight away and that's where we are. And that's the impact that we can have. So suddenly we look at these 3 biases and I want you to just think about these as I go through this afternoon and share with you, the what I will talk about shortly in terms of the 5 dysfunctions around the boardroom and getting away from that show and tell to them when I conclude today and introduce you to the 4 disciplines of a healthy organization. So let's just have a little bit of a gambit and a wander into the mindset. And I want to introduce you to a concept that I have, and it does relate very much to my military experience. And I use this phrase of getting below or getting above the parapet. Now, for those of you, just to give you some clarity, a parapet is effectively the lip of a trench. And I can remember both as a young soldier, a commander and a leader, that there were occasions where, you find yourself in a trench, quite literally. And certainly on my most recent, it's a good 10 years ago now, but, in Afghanistan, that we would find ourselves, below the lip of this parapet. But the reality there as a commander, if I was below the lip of the parapet, I couldn't influence, I couldn't see what's going on. There's no value that I had. And indeed, although there's a perceived safety, it's a dangerous place to be. So there are occasions where you absolutely have to get your head above the parapet. And it allowed me to build this, this link to what I experience with mindset today and how individuals respond today. And as I go through this, I just want you to have a think about this notional line, which is, being above and below the parapet. And often when we're below the parapet, the thing that we often come across is blame, excuse, and denial. And it's really when you start to sit around the boardroom table, when you start to sit around that management group for the business, or the leadership group for the business or organization that you're in, how often do you come across this blame, excuse, and denial? It wasn't my fault. There's nothing to do with me, or there is an excuse that you can actually lean on straight away. That somebody else was supposed to do it, because there's blame there. And we often find that this is just something that there's almost a natural response. And it's about this mindset shift when we start to then focus about getting above the parapet. And above the parapet resides responsibility, accountability, and ownership. We become response-able. We've become able to take responsibility for, actually it was my responsibility. It was down to me. And, I put my hands up. I take accountability for not doing it, and I'll have full ownership. So when you start to reflect on this, let me give you some context as to why this is really, really important. And in the very first instance, before we dive into those dysfunctions, I really want to think about, how do you turn up? When you hold the mirror, is there elements of what I'm going to talk about now that actually they reflect directly on you? And once you've done that, is okay. How does this stack up against the others that I collaborate with, the others around the table, those that I'm working alongside? So the first one is when we're below. It's often this word why exists. Now I'm a high performance coach, and I don't like why as a question because it's a lazy word. If you think about it, if I ask somebody a why question, and the classic one that I always use is, why were you late? So imagine you coming in, why are you late to the meeting? The moment you ask a why question, we evoke an emotive response. So just think about that for a moment. We evoke a emotive response. And as an emotive response, we often just immediately go into this, below the line, below the parapet response of blame, excuse, and denial, where we have to start and think. What we actually end up is really contemplating the how opportunity. So not asking the why and being stuck in this why context, but rather focusing on how. Now, this directly links to the, being below and being stuck in the past. We all too often, and we've probably seen it over the last 12 months, why has this happened to us? Before COVID, everything was glorious and it was great and we were doing this, but why has this happened to us? And we ended up looking back in terms of, being stuck in the past. A lot of people at the moment are looking to the future and thinking, we're going to be out of lockdown soon. It's going to be great. We'll be back to normal. And I generally don't think it will be. I think people have gone through significant change. But here's where it gets really exciting when we look at responsibility, accountability, and ownership, because we start to focus on the future. And I dare say that that's what's attracted you to come along today. You have a question that you want answered. You have a query that you want to resolve or resolution to. And that focuses on a future prospect. And the great thing with the future is, what are the long-term aspirations, the infinite opportunities of the future. And that's where we can really start to focus on what that looks like. Linking to this is how we use language and the difference between judging questions, hence why is a poor question in that respect, and learning questions, and how the learning question can have quite a significant impact in terms of what you've got to think to ask a learning question. You've got to determine what is the response. It's all too easy to come up with a judging question straight away. So when we have to take a moment and think, it's kind of, there's a little bit more challenge there. What is the best response? What's the best learning outcome for me and, the other person in this conversation? Now, that's really interesting when we look at that around the boardroom. And I'm going to really tap into that in a little while, which will be quite interesting in terms of the context of then asking those learning questions and the way in which we can do that. Now, the final piece of context in this one, when we start looking at business, is really, I guess, what I would always determine as our financial mindset. Do we have a poor financial mindset, or do we have a wealthy financial mindset? Do we look at bad debt and all debt is bad, or do we look at how do we use other people's money to invest in the growth and development of the business? Now, when we're in a boardroom situation, how do we have those conversations? How do they turn up? How does that have an impact in terms of what it is and how we do what we do going forward? Now, looking at both the above and below the line, we can start to see that if we find ourselves in this place below the line, the challenge is that we've almost got to manage out of what we would term as a fixed mindset. We've got to put process and procedure, rules in place to start to challenge people to think differently. And that's what I'm going to challenge you to think about this afternoon when we start to look at that boardroom show and tell, to stop people just turning up to a meeting and just giving us the insight of the past, but rather than start turning up to the meeting with a real focus in terms of the opportunities of the future, the learning opportunities that we can embrace as an organization, that we can challenge each other with. And this is where we can see that growth of organizational health. Now, just one last piece that I wanted to share with regards to the context of this one is when we look at responsibility, accountability, and ownership, we really start to focus on the fact that that is owned by us. It is done by me. I take full accountability for that. I am the one that is, that's going to make the difference on that side of it. Whereas when we look below in terms of blame, excuse and denial, it's this mindset of, I know best and it's done to me. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's. And it's kind of being able to shift away from that. Now, just give me a bit of a sense, dive into the chat and just tell me if, what we've just chatted about there is resonated with you. Because the interesting point on this one, the bit that is most overlooked is above the parapet. When we look at this above the parapet focus, when we look at this level of accountability, where we take responsibility and ultimately have ownership, the point there is most people overlook this and don't really recognize the benefits and values of their contribution above the parapet, getting above this notional line. So I wanted to offer that really as a bit of a background before I then dive into what we're going to talk about in terms of the 5 dysfunctions. Now, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, we're going to talk about this in the context of actually, around the board table. And there's a guy called Patrick Lencioni who's the brains behind this. And it's really quite interesting when we start to look at actually how these dysfunctions turn up. Navid now just given you a bit of an insight to the kind of mindsets that we expect and see around the table. The 5 dysfunctions will now start to give you an idea of actually how we can really get that organizational health and cohesiveness around the table, around that boardroom, around that management team and that leadership team, to have a really significant impact, on the business going forward. And I'm hoping that this is all making sense with everybody so far. Okay, so what are the 5 dysfunctions? Well, I'm going to go through each of them in a bit of detail, but just to give you a bit of an insight, that the foundation of this one that is the absence of trust. So there's a real lack of trust in the boardroom, a lack of trust around that table. There is the fear of conflict, where, there is a real sense of I guess, almost foreboding that, dare I say anything that might not agree with somebody else. That leads to this lack of commitment. And if you go back to what I just talked about above and below the line, that lack of commitment is absolutely key when you start to look at it in that response. So the lack of commitment is something that is quite prevalent in there. And then we've got the, poor accountability. So again, going above the line, there is a real sense of poor accountability. And ultimately, there is no real focus on results. So what I'd like to do now is I just want to go through each one of these. And firstly, I'm going to give you a bit of an insight as to the context of it. And then I want to give you for each one actually some of the areas in which and how you can actually focus on having quite a significant impact on them and what you can do to change. So do make sure you got your notebooks ready to make some notes on that one. And I do recommend jotting down a few notes as you go, because it helps with you, reflecting and memorizing it. And then the other side is, this recording will be made available afterwards. So you'll be able to go back through and review the actual recording and, whisk past the bits that you didn't find interesting into the bits that are valuable to you. So absence of trust in the first instance. So the absence of trust is really an inability to have and demonstrate vulnerability in the room. Now, this is something, if you imagine from a military context, for me was, it almost felt, when I learned this, it feels a little bit alien. But when I reflected on it and looked back, it was absolutely on point with regards to the level of vulnerability that I would share with my colleagues on the front line, that we shared fear together. And it's not so much, a conversation about trust, but it's actually more a case of, when I'm in need, you're going to know I'm in need. And likewise, when you're in need, you're in a great place because I'm going to have your back. And it is almost that level of trust, that level of real, building camaraderie around your board table. that it's actually okay to be vulnerable in the boardroom, to say something and actually, make a mistake. The challenge with this is when we see this as an absence of trust is this obligatory attendance of meetings, where, I go to the meeting and I'll go through the motions. I mean, anybody ever experienced that? I'm going to be pretty certain that you almost certainly had. So that's one sign that there is an absence of trust. The other one is, actually the decisions, they don't get made around the table. The real decisions are made at the water cooler, over a cup of coffee, in the corridors, halls of the business. We don't bring to the boardroom the real, focus on what we need to be discussing around that table, because what's the point? So it's when we have this absence of trust, it's a sure sign that there is a lack of collaboration, a lack of cohesion around the table. And it's where, that first point of communication, from that point onwards, you're not going to communicate authentically. You're not going to communicate honestly and openly. So what can we do about that? How can we start to build, trust? What is it that we can start to really focus on in terms of, actually making a difference there? And it really focuses on how we can start to understand each other. How many times have you had a conversation not about your position, your work, but with a colleague in relation to who they are and what they do, in terms of their life, just getting to know somebody. The reality on this is the more that we take time and experience to build those relationships. There's a lot of, talk about these, corporate away days. But actually, when you do it right, there's a real focus in terms of building those bonds, of going away and doing something that creates that level of trust. The team trust activity, or activities that, have a high perceived risk, but actually there's a low risk in terms of the physical activities that you're doing. Now, again, I can take this from the extreme of my military career, where actually, the risk was that bit that absolutely, built the trust, that bonded that trust, that had it as a foundation. So what does this lead on to? Well, it kind of leads on to the next piece, which is this, this fear of conflict. Now, it's a really interesting one here, the fear of conflict. And I just want to, if we put this into context, one of the root causes of this is actually our freeze, flight and fight response, that primeval element of our limbic brain that just has a reaction straight away. But the point is, it doesn't mean that it turns up as a freeze, flight and fight. But it does turn up, if you jot this down, you remember it for ape, it turns up where we can see, actually people who don't want to be in this place of conflict, believe it or not, getting aggressive, being aggressive, overly aggressive, to actually get away from conflict, to, that's that fight response, aggressiveness. And then there's the passive response, the freeze response, where actually I'm going to sink into my seat. I'm not actually going to engage. I'll be here, but if I don't say anything, no one's going to notice me. And then we've got that flight response, which is known as escape. So how do I get out of this? So I might be late for the meeting. I might not even turn up for the meeting. So when we start to look at fear of conflict, we're not really energizing the group in terms of having what we would term as constructive conflict, where it's actually around the table. There is, because of that trust that's there, the trust that I can be vulnerable in front of my peer group, the trust that I can say something, there's no stupid questions, that I can be, wrong. The trust that I can bring a view to the table, but actually through this engaging, challenging, candid conflict, that you might change my mind, that I'm going to be on board with it. It's kind of, when we have really constructive conflict, where that's part of the rules, it really does make a massive difference. I mean, there's an interesting one. You ever watch the Apollo 13 or read into the Apollo 13 case when they were, looking at going to the moon? Actually that ability to have that creative, that, constructive conflict, it meant they brought them back again, because in the rooms they would constantly be, challenging each other on the different opportunities that were there. How can we do this better? How can we shift this better? What's the way of actually changing the way we can move this going forward? So it starts to have a significant impact in that respect. And essentially what we have when we have fear of conflict is this artificial harmony. It's just a case of people around the table, we're going through the motions. We're not really engaging in meaningful dialogue, hence the show and tell. We're just bringing a quick snapshot of actually, what it is that we said we were doing, or what we've done over the past few months or past week or whatever that time scale is. So how can we actually start to encourage healthy conflict? One of the things you can do is what we term as mining for conflict, whereas when somebody asks a question or is, getting involved in that respect, you can actually start to, challenge deeper, asking greater learning questions to dig deep. One of the phrases you can think about is play dumb and dig deep. Ask more questions about what it is that they're talking about. Go out there and actually, look for the opportunities, because once we find those areas, that's where the real magic starts in any business. But when we have that fear of conflict, then people will ignore, dismiss, or change the topics or blunder through critical moments just on a view to keeping the peace, in a hope that we move forward. And we've got to encourage this real focus in terms of just encouraging conflict around the table. Set some rules out. Doesn't never need to be personal. You never need to, be deflammatory to anybody else. Yep, you're absolutely going to raise your voice. You're going to get, uptight about some of the aspects that you may talk about. But the reality of this productive conflict and really, actually going through this. And this is the interesting point as well. So if you have a look at, an operations board or board of directors, you've got people who are responsible for certain aspects of the business, the organization. What's really interesting is you might not be, the financial controller, the director of finances, but you might be the person that is able to actually have that question that unlocks something that you're probably not an expert in. And it has a massive, massive impact in that respect, because we suddenly start to see everybody around the table focused and looking to achieve, what is right for the organization. There is a real understanding that we can start to, really generate this momentum going forward. So getting beyond the fear of conflict, actually creating, productive conflict. Now, leading on from this, the next piece that's a challenge is where there is a lack of commitment. And, this is essentially, if you go back to that above and below the parapet piece, this is where the, responsibility, accountability and ownership come into it. There is essentially, there is just ambiguity around the table. Who is responsible for this, or actually, what did we agree in the meeting, and then what is the next element that we've got to have a look at. When we start to really focus in terms of creating a higher level of commitment, we really have started to secure this mindset of being above the parapet, of taking responsibility, of that accountability, of ownership. Now, if all of us around the table have that mindset, suddenly that trust of being vulnerable, that, digging and mining for conflict actually creates a higher level of commitment. It encourages us to start to engage in whole new ways and looking for whole new opportunities. And again, all the while we're doing this, we're creating this cohesive focus around the table. And the challenge is all too often that these are the things that are missing, from a boardroom, when we just go through the motions. And don't forget what I said, I've got no, challenge at all with regards to, I am sure that many of you on the call today are from, truly smart and functional organizations. But these areas, these 5 areas of dysfunction, they limit the ability for the business to actually develop and grow in a way that is going to be meaningful. And that's why, again, this is a focus on organizational health. So when we start to look at this about gaining commitment, let's get more focus. Let's look at creating an agenda. Let's look at when we're discussing something that actually at the back end of it, we make a choice and we're able to make and gain a high level of clarity because actually somebody is taking responsibility for that, taking accountability for it, ultimate ownership. It really starts to move the organization in the right direction. And you can start to see how these stack up. So gaining that commitment is a major step, but it's not the final step, in terms of this process of going forward, but it's a major one where we're able to get, consistency. An interesting one as well. I've seen this many times, and certainly where I've engaged with board members directly as well, as a facilitator. Sometimes we end up going around the table and doing this show and tell, and we, to get away from that, one of the things that we can actually do is sometimes we take a deep dive looking for that conflict and we find something that is going to be palpable for us to work on. We get clarity and we make the commitment to come to a resolution on that. And actually what we're going to do is we're not going to leave the boardroom till we've resolved this particular one and come up with a resolution of how we're going to move it forward. Because the moment we get that level of commitment around the table, the next piece that we actually are able to deal with is a higher level of accountability. So for the vast, again, smart organizations are doing this, but for the vast amount of organizations, they find themselves in this place where there is avoidance of accountability. There's essentially what we would term as having low standards. So when we start to look at this, and again, these aren't necessarily verbalized to low standards. What I talk about this afternoon and what I'm sharing with you, these are kind of underlying currents that they're not, there's no rules that say this is the way that we behave, but these are just habits. Now, what I'm asking you to do today is to start down a road of creating, maybe one or two new habits, which is going to create a different level of discipline around the table. Now, the interesting point in this, if we then start to stack up a few more habits on top of that, in terms of that trust, in terms of that, bringing and looking for conflict around the table, because we know that that's where organizational health resides, where we look at creating a high level of, commitment. When we start to put all of those disciplines together, we start to put all of those habits together, and it becomes a safe place to engage in that way. What tends to happen is we create character, and we can start to see the true characters coming out around the table. We can start to see a real impact, and suddenly, people come to life around the table in terms of their level of engagement and the difference that they can actually make. So when we start to, get away from this, and there's time to go. Because if you think about this to start with, if we've got to go right back to that foundation, building trust isn't going to be just a quick fix. There's going to be, how do we absolutely start to embed this? What are the rules of the game that we now need to start to bring to build this cohesive, focus around the table? So how do we build accountability? So building accountability is really starting to, to move away from an unwillingness of team members to actually, feeling discomfort around the table, to actually starting to go, do you know what? Yeah, this is where the magic happens in our organization. So I need to set goals. And it could be that, we set individual goals, or that, we go away and when we're doing our planning meetings, that we're really clear in terms of what these goals are. And actually, as a performance coach, this is where the magic lies for me, because it's about creating stretch goals. If we agree something that we need to be focusing on, then actually one of the things is that we as an individual, I'm going to do my very best to do what I need to do on this goal. There's a mindset I have here when we start looking at accountability at this level is the phrase I often use is we empowers me. Think about that for a moment. We empowers me. When we start to look at we empowers me, actually I'm going to turn up at this table and be the very best version of me. I'm going to be, vulnerable in terms of what it is that I need to share. I'm going to be challenging in terms of, looking out for the best interest of the organizations. I'm going to be fully committed. I'm going to take full accountability because I know that you opposite me on the table, you next to me on the table are going to be doing the same thing. Now, the reality is if you think about this for a moment in your own environment, your own circumstances, your own experience, can you honestly say that that happens around your boardroom right now? Is that part of the reason why you've come to, maybe get some of those questions asked today or answered today, or certainly to get you thinking along those terms? The second one is set high standards. Get really clear on the standards that you want to set in terms of how we're going to be moving this forward. What are the standards that we are going to expect? And when we set those standards, making sure that they're appropriate to the business, they are professional, they are lawful, but these are the standards that we expect. These are the level of accountability. In terms of the accountability side of life as well, is make them public. Why not let people know exactly what it is you're doing? Get a scoreboard. Be visual in terms of, a scoreboard. I often talk to business owners about creating that dashboard. A dashboard's a great way of creating high levels of accountability. What about regular progress on meetings as well? So, actually we are looking at how we're moving forward on some of these areas that we're actually working on right now. Is it having a significant impact going forward? And recognition, reward and recognition. How can we recognize that, that actually we've got high levels of accountability, that we're doing really well? And high levels of accountability, the next piece and I guess the point of the pyramid here is then our ability to, actually create the results. Because the fifth dysfunction is there is no focus on results. Let me ask you the question. How many times have milestones been set and yet they've just wafted by and we've gone back to the boardroom and no, we didn't make that milestone and this is the reason, the excuse, and this is why I'm blaming other people for not getting there? And I know this sounds quite stark and it sounds quite harsh. But again, when you look at this in terms of reflecting, what is the reality on that? Is that something that you resonate yourself? Actually, is there a focus here that, we've got to get to a point that, actually we need to make sure that results matter. We need to make sure that, this whole focus with regards to getting to where we want to get to is absolutely, clear and unequivocal that, our responsibility in the organizational and being a smart business is that we're actually able to create the results that we're looking for, to get to the, the next level, to, grow and develop the business. It is, when we get really focused on these results, it is about actually creating this almost public declaration of this is what we're doing and this is what we're doing really well. I guess there's a point here of being fatigued and tired of having milestones slip to the right, of never really getting to the top of the priorities, of rather we just go there and we have a ticking exercise of step by step going through a list of stuff to get done, rather than meaningful and purposeful shift going forward. If you look at the really good organizations, the ones that have this organizational health that really focus on this one, we can start to really understand that, where we've got these 5 dysfunctions, where they reside and exist in an organization, then we can do something about that. So what is it that, comes to mind when we start to look at this? Just take a quick moment just to reflect on those 5 areas, the absence of trust, the fear of conflict, the lack of commitment, the non-accountable, and no focus on results. And where's the impact for you? What's the bit that's resonated with you so far this afternoon? Because what I want to go into next is then have a bit of a talk about, how it works with being a healthy organization. So just pop into the chat, give us a bit of an insight as to where we are, whether this is resonating with you today. And maybe, is there already a commitment for you that you've identified in terms of how I can start to shift this one around? And interesting there, actually, one of the things that's coming through on there is this notion that, I've used the word business, but I also use the word organization for the reason that not all businesses are the same. You've got sporting organizations out there. If you take where we are locally, we've got and I know we've got on the call today, Exeter City Football Club. We've got Sandy Park and the Rugby Club. We've got cricket clubs. You've got charitable organisations. But the interesting point on it is they all have a group of people that are responsible for, the organisation. And probably, as I'll demonstrate in just a moment, they're probably responsible for the organisation being smart. But what we're talking about this afternoon is those idiosyncrasies that in the 5 dysfunctions is how we shift it towards being a healthy organization. How do we start to shift towards, actually utilizing the real true power of a group of people who have responsibility for an organization to really be focusing on taking it in the right direction. And that's where the challenge lies. For me as a high performance coach, when I work with executives, I really do challenge them on this. And it stands out, it really does stand out when you sit in a boardroom and you can see this. Because you can just see the interaction. And I'm absolutely positive that you've got your own experiences on this one where you can start to see organizations where there is that, and it does start at that foundation, there is an absence of trust. So I can see some comments coming through. So it's good to know that we're resonating in that respect. So I want to spend the last few minutes really before I guess I round up today on actually what it is to be that being a smart organization is only really half of the equation here. So smart organizations, they will be doing the fundamentals of any organization that should be doing, and let's look at this in the business context here. And indeed, actually, we just mentioned some sporting venues. I can guarantee that they'll be doing the same thing. I'm a director of my local rugby club, and all 4 of these smart things are all elements that we absolutely focus on. We look at creating the strategy of where we're going to go. What is the high level focus that we need to be developing in order to move our organization forward? What do we need to be doing marketing wise? How are we getting our message out there with clarity? How are we attracting people to engage with us? What are we doing in terms of our finances? Are we creating really healthy cash flow? Do we have financial mastery? Today, do we use technology? And I think actually, over the last 12 months through the challenges that we faced, that we've seen technology take incredible new leaps. But here's the interesting point. These are smart organizations, but those smart organizations will probably still be suffering from the 5 dysfunctions around the boardroom. They'll still be suffering from the show and tell. And they won't be unlocking the absolute true potential of either the management teams, the leadership teams, the executives, the team members themselves, the business itself. But when we then start to look at a healthy organization, we suddenly start to shift our focus there. We start to look at, healthy organizations that have just enough policy to support people in what it is that they need to do so that it is appropriate, professional and law-abiding. So whether that's health and safety, whether it's equality and diversity, whether it's, the rules of the game of how we respect each other and selfless commitment, whatever, it might be that we look in terms of those core values, but how we see them turning up each and every day. But that we have just enough policy for us to really understand what it is that we want to achieve. We have minimal confusion. Now, it's an interesting one here in terms of minimal confusion. So what happens in the boardroom, what goes on around the boardroom, how much of that actually resonates down at grassroots levels? How much of that message gets there, with clarity? Because I often find actually when you go into an organization and start asking the grassroots levels, what's the key focus this quarter in the business? What's the plan that we're working on? Where is the business heading? Where is the organization heading? What's the main focus of the organization? People will have an idea, but they'll never really have that real clarity. There is confusion. It's kind of classic example of the Chinese whispers. So then we start looking at it in terms of a healthy organization as high morale. Now, people are pretty happy to work there. Now, what's really interesting, the organizations that have got this nailed over the last 12 months have maintained that morale in the most challengings of time. And that's really interesting because that leads also to high productivity. We've got loads of people that are doing great jobs, that are doing really good work, because there is a high level of productivity in a healthy organization. And most importantly, again, take a look at this and just have a look at your own organization. There is a low to no turnover of really good people. In other words, we attract good people onto our organizational bus and we keep them there, to use a Jim Collins-ism, getting the right people on the bus. These are some of the aspects of, where we're a smart organization. If that resonates with you right now, and then, we've got some great work to do. But the joy of it is, as we said at the beginning, none of it is really difficult to get to. It just takes commitment and a reframing of what it is that we need to do going forward. So one of the things I said I'd do is I wanted to introduce you at the end of today to what I term as the 4 disciplines of a healthy organization. We've spent this afternoon talking really about our first discipline in terms of building a cohesive leadership team. So as I, use that phrase, getting away from show and tell at the boardroom level, getting away from the show and tell of that management and leadership team, that we actually start to focus on those 5 areas and get away from the 5 dysfunctions. And rather we start to focus, and we can focus on a high level of trust, of conflict, of commitment, of accountability, and ultimately of getting results. Building that cohesive team is absolutely the first step. And it's a first discipline towards actually creating a really healthy organization. And then as I was just chatting about that, the second level, the second discipline is creating clarity. And what's really interesting here is this is where we get true alignment throughout an organization. Alignment is where everybody knows what's going on, what's required of them, what's their responsibility. And as we've mentioned, it starts with that leadership team. And we then, infuse it throughout the entire organization where we create high level clarity. And creating that high level clarity is it's a major step towards, true alignment. Now, what's really interesting on this one is reinforcing clarity, that third discipline. So where we create the clarity, where we get the message out there, what do we do? What's the habits that we have in the organization, the rituals that we have in the organization to constantly be reinforcing, recognizing, seeing, identifying, celebrating the fact that we understand and know what it is that we're about and what we're doing. That we come out of a boardroom meeting and immediately the team are excited to know what's going on because we immediately reinforce actually what's the next iteration, what we've just discussed, what's the next decision. Even to the point where actually we go into the boardroom excited because we've got ideas to take from the team in terms of reinforcing the clarity. So where we create that clarity, we then reinforce that clarity. And the 4th discipline is over-communicating that clarity. Now, I want you to just think about that. Clarity comes into this quite a lot, but the reason it does is because, let's be fair, we used to have a phrase in the military where, you were often kept, treated like a mushroom, kept in the dark, and I won't use the actual expletive, but fed on manure. And sometimes that you kind of, depend on the situation. Sometimes that was quite true. You just didn't know what was going on. Now, whether or not that was for securities, whatever the circumstances, I'm sure sometimes that you will reflect, and that will be something that you recognize in your organization. So how do we start to focus this? Well, the first start is to look, do those 5 dysfunctions reside? Are they existent? Do you recognize them in your organization? Because that's the first step. How do we start to focus on those disciplines to actually start to build a cohesive leadership team? Then we create clarity, we reinforce clarity, and then we constantly over-communicate clarity. We celebrate, we talk about it, we create the rituals. Everything that we do, is always revolved around actually we're moving that forward. And it will constantly move us forward in the direction that we need to go. The final piece I want to talk about really is this, this thing, fear. And in the context of where we are today, I talked earlier about the freeze, flight and fight. That still exists in each of us. But what's really interesting, and the way I often see fear turning up, is what I term as interference. If you're someone that sat in the boardroom today, if you're on the leadership team, the management team, and you've sat there in the past, and we used to have a phrase that I always had in the back of my mind: do what you ought and not what you want. Knowing that you ought to be, saying, challenging, mining for conflict, challenging somebody on a point of view they've got around the table, disagreeing with somebody. But what you want to do is to sit quietly, to not have that conflict, to not be that person asking the question, to, actually I'll have a chat with them quietly at the water cooler afterwards. That is fear that is getting in the way. It is fear that is holding you back. And I just want you to again, if I take it this full circle and I look at getting above the parapet, when I look at, responsibility, accountability and ownership, it starts with us holding the mirror up first, and then being able to actually start to engage with, our teams and our colleagues in terms of, might be educating them. And to be fair, as a coach, that is my whole role and responsibility in life, is how do I unlock that potential? How do I help people to deal with their different levels of interference to turn up the very best version of them, to break out of that mold, to actually to have the confidence and the excitement that I'm going into a meeting and I'm going to really have, a real focus in terms of, how we can take this to the next level. I'm excited to be a part of the group. Now, I hope what I've said today has made sense with you, and it's been, resonant. To be fair, I didn't want to take a huge length of time. I could talk about this all afternoon, but I think actually 60 minutes gets the point across. If you've valued, just let me know in the chat what's been the key takeaway for you today. What's been the learning that you've taken from this? I think when this is finished, you'll get a quick poll. It's just 4 questions that you'll get, which, if you don't mind, it would be fantastic if you can just take a moment just to let us know how we did. And whether you got some value out of today's session. I'm always striving to offer the very, very best I can. So if you found that useful, then it would be incredibly helpful for us in that respect. And the final thing I'd like to say is that, one, you'll get this recording so you can reflect on it. And I'm more than happy to have a conversation with any one of you with regards to what it is you've learned today. The one thing to take away from this is if you've taken some learning, then the best thing you can do, go back to what I said at the beginning, is act on it. Act on those learnings. Whether that's a case of, actually we can have a conversation and I'll quite happily coach you through this in terms of yourself, or whether it's a case of taking it back to your board and saying, actually, do you know what, this is something we need to look at. Then my job is done today. The greatest way that you can show some, I guess, if there is any thanks or gratitude, just jump onto my LinkedIn. If we haven't connected already, then let's connect and hook up and drop us a comment. Let me know how you found this afternoon's session. And to be fair, good or bad, I'm quite happy to take you mining for conflict with me. because in my pursuit is to be the very best version of me as a high performance coach for you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got for you this afternoon. If there's any questions in there, I'm happy to take a couple of moments just to dive into. Otherwise, I will let you get on with your day to day. So let's just see if there's anything comes in, and if I don't have time for them, then I'll certainly pick it up with Sam afterwards and look at answering those questions as we go.